Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the study guide. This time we're doing guard retention, and this one's been heavily requested, so thank you guys so much for sending in requests on specific topics. Keep them coming, that way I could schedule in different topics for the future.
Hey, let's go.
Okay, so guard retention. Now, I kept my chart this time pretty basic, just because I think guard retention is a small aspect of a more larger broad topic, which is attacking people from guard. Now, don't get me wrong, guard retention is a really important skill, and it's a first step to having a really good guard game. In the most recent match between Joseph Chen and Isaac Michel at AEGA, Joseph showed some really stellar guard retention. However, the more matches I see of players with really good guard retention, the more I realize that we're missing the bigger picture. When first learning about guard retention, I left out a really key concept that hindered my game a bit. And it was so obvious that the moment I learned about it, it became a fundamental shift in my jiu-jitsu game. Okay, so to start off, guard retention is the defensive aspect of guard play. It consists of movements that deny your opponent's desire to pin and pass your legs. Now, whether your opponent's trying to create angles or get grips, they're trying to pass your guard from top to bottom. And then the two major ways that someone can pass guard is mobility-based, is akin to utilizing movement to outpace your opponent on the bottom. And the second way to pass guard would be pressure-based, which is the person on top trying to actually slow down the movement of the person on bottom and immobilizing the defensive person's legs. Now, this next point might be a bit off topic, but we want to keep this in mind when we're playing open guard. So remember how I said that guard retention is a smaller aspect of playing open guard? When we get more advanced into guard retention, we have to start thinking about counterattacking. As well, like if we can understand the points of balance that your opponent decides to take wherever they're moving, we can then start to think about more efficient movements whenever we're trying to retain our guard. So when it comes down to guard retention, we're trying to deny our opponent's ability to pass these specific lines. Okay, Danaher calls them demarcation lines, and I personally like to think of these checkpoints as kind of like the DEFCON zones for the US president. Like, oh, like passing the toes is DEFCON 1, hip lines DEFCON 2. You get the idea.
Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high.
Cobra Date, is this an exercise?
Negative, this is not an exercise.
All right, so first up we have the toe line. So right now, Isaac Michel is trying to hold the feet and trying to get past the legs. And then in the context of a Toriando, it's getting those leg grips and then tossing them around to get an advantageous angle. From here, 2 and 3, the hip line and the center line kind of go hand in hand. In this clip right here, Goran Ryan showing the J-point passing. At this point, if an opponent can pass the center line and the hip line, then you're in serious jeopardy of getting your guard passed. The majority of guard retention movement is to deny this right here. Finally, the shoulder line. So going into the shoulder line becomes a bit more advanced because this is when a lot of opponents will go into north-south and start to work their passes from there. All in all, whether you're playing a butterfly guard or a supine guard, the goal of your opponents will be to force you to move and exploit these angles until they can find an opening. All right, so the most game-changing insight that I've learned from guard retention is that no matter how good your guard retention is going to be, no matter how many movements that you're going to do, you will eventually get your guard passed. And the simple insight to this is that the person who's standing and is not playing guard has a mechanical advantage over you in that they can move around and they can initiate passes, generating movement, or disengaging if they really wanted to. So this was a difficult idea for me to grasp because when I first started jiu-jitsu, we would always be doing these guard retention drills. And the better that I got at guard retention, I would always stay in that guard retaining pocket to see how deep I can get within the guard retention instead of going and trying to advance my position and start to work my attacks. What eventually made my jiu-jitsu better after learning this insight was just to start attacking and just to start gaining grips. And then from those retaining pockets, see like what are some advantageous grips that are, say, like better than others, and like, you know, what can advance my position overall. I'll drive in this point later, but the premise is that guard retention is very taxing energy-wise. On top of that, because you're at a mechanical disadvantage playing from bottom, we need to think about becoming more offensive on the bottom, and therefore, instead of the one being taxed by energy, we're actually taxing other people from the bottom. So this is a really good clip of Gordon Ryan playing guard from bottom. And I previously cut out 30 seconds of him playing guard, but see here how he grabs the reverse De La Riva grip. And from here, immediately he starts attacking. And so he's not retaining guard forever. Eventually, like, he has to find his openings to start attacking. Now, granted, although this attack itself might fail, at least it's less energy consuming than if you were to be supine and constantly have to work off your back. All right, so what I love about guard retention actually is that if we're searching up resources online, there's actually a lot of good free resources for learning guard retention. For beginners just starting out learning guard retention, I would say focus on cardio, as well as also think about like the bigger picture, because eventually we want to start to be able to counter attack instead of being always in that guard retention pocket. But let's dive a bit deeper into getting into those points of becoming a good guard retainer. All right, so starting off, we have Advanced Basics by Firas Zahabi. Now, this is probably one of the best instructionals in terms of showing all the dynamic movements that are in guard retention. However, I think the one issue with that instructional is that he doesn't really go too in-depth on the details and concepts, such as like talking about like the demarcation lines, points of controls, and how to counterattack. So from there, I would watch the New Wave Open Guard because that goes way more in-depth on the conceptual stuff, as well as going further into details on counterattacking in the future. Keep in mind, New Wave Open Guard has 2 volumes. The first volume is on supine and guard retention, while the second one focuses more on butterfly guard and wrestle ups. All in all, as far as pure guard retention goes, these are probably the 2 best resources for understanding the movements. All right, remember when I said eventually you'll get past? Well, this quote's on eventually, because what we want to do is we want to be able to retain guard just long enough so that we could start working our attacks. But that being said, like when I first got into jiu-jitsu, like I said before, like I found my core to be very weak and pretty underutilized as like a muscle. So I found that whenever I worked on my cardio becoming better, my guard retention inevitably got better as well. As far as conditioning goes, having a good cardio program will definitely help your guard retention, as well as like other aspects of your jiu-jitsu game as well, like say like wrestling, pinning, isometric control, etc., etc. On BJJ Fanatics, there's Solo BJJ by John Danaher. It's completely free. I believe it was filmed during the Great Purge, and it's a great instructional for beginners trying to understand the movements of guard retention. All right, so now that you know what to do and you're in shape, so let's start doing some positional sparring. Although there's some heuristic movements in terms of guard retention, it's really hard to put into words and actually describe to people. And the more I watch other people do guard retention, I see them doing slightly different variations. And so I think being able to do positional sparring rounds with your partner is probably the best way to understand and start to learn guard retention. So recently I've been watching some of Greg Souders' content on his ecological approach, and I do appreciate the idea of making positional rounds into games in which the person on top and bottom have specific goals to play around. Specifically for learning guard retention, this may be a really good way to accelerate your learning. Lastly, I want to give a big shout out to Less Impressed More Involved's course on half guard passing. By learning what I need to pass, I ended up learning a bunch of stuff on how to retain guard and how to prevent people from passing. All right, so moving on into more deeper studies, They Shall Not Pass by Gordon Ryan's a great instructional. However, it goes into very, very specific movements on guard retention. Studying this instructional became a really big reason for me to start recording my own sparring and rolling footage. Guard retention techniques happen really quick and really fast. And so being able to record myself, I was able to see how my movements are similar and also how they're different in terms of like what I see and like what I'm trying to learn. A tip if you decide to watch this instructional is to make notes. I'm still trying to memorize some of the movements and motions, but I think eventually there'll come a point where I have to rely more on feel than on actually memorizing all the possible movements. Moving on, there's Enter the System leg locks. Now, this instructional is going to help you recognize those openings for counter-attacking entries. I find a lot of guard instructionals focus a lot on leg entries, but not a lot of them go too in-depth on the actual finishing mechanics. So entering the system leg locks is a really good instructional in your learning arsenal. So last but not least, if we're gonna work on becoming a good guard player, I think the best content to watch would be Marcelo Garcia's MG in Action. I believe that's a subscription-based service right now online. I've watched a few of his instructionals on guard attacking, and I think the instructionals on BJJ Fanatics are taking clips from his classes and seminars and then posting it into a package. I'm going to be circling back and looking more at his content in the future. I think all in all, subscribing to his app might be a better way of saving my money. A big thing that my coach is preaching right now in class is becoming super offensive and aggressive on the bottom. And after studying some of Marcelo Garcia's game, I can kind of see like where that comes from. It's that, you know, always keeping the pressure as the bottom player to the person on top. And again, in the long run, it's probably going to be less taxing energy-wise and will keep you
winning.
All right, so that's it for this week's study guide. Now, a final note on guard retention. I think the best way to study guard retention is to watch footage and see how other athletes are moving and, you know, kind of get a grasp as to why. But overall, I would say that keep guard retention simple starting out, and just know that in the long run, the main goal is to become a good attacker, even from the bottom. If you're interested in having this chart, please follow me on Instagram and I'll shoot you a message with the link to the Google Drive. And as always, if you've enjoyed this video and you found it helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. And just remember, as always, if you have time to kill, you have time to drill. Peace.